So I think this is perfect time to open it off of laughter.
Yeah.
Welcome everyone to the Soulstenance. We updated the name,
Yeah.
so we're changing the logo and also figuring out our first in-person podcast. So it might be shifting around.
Mm-hmm.
But Soulstenance, we've got a lot of good feedback from that. It's funny how that name came to be. Um, we were just talking about the sustenance from the soul,
Mm-hmm.
and that Joe and I were talking, and he just said, that's her name. And I checked in and it just really landed. So we hope y'all like the name.
Yeah.
And Empower Your Essence will kind of fade out in the next month or so. New logo coming. And yeah, anything else you want to?
Excited to, as Dustin said, this is our first recording a podcast that we're actually in the same room
Yeah.
recording. Um, just fun. We were laughing. One of the reasons we were laughing right when it started was just there's some kinks to still be worked out that we didn't necessarily have time to do this time. We're
Yeah.
sitting
Yeah.
physically a lot closer
Mm-hmm.
together than we
Yeah.
typically do when we have conversations.
You know, our thighs may be touching.
It
That
feels
may be
feels
happening.
more personal than it often does. Uh,
More than eye gazing.
yeah, exactly. This is more than soul connection right now. So anyway, it's just funny, but we're excited to be here and have the opportunity to actually record
Yeah.
a conversation that we're having in the same room.
Yeah, it's a first. So yeah, bear with us if there's any interesting, funny things, and if you want to leave a comment too, we're open to that as well. So yeah, today, all right. So we one of our friends
Mm-hmm.
sent us a podcast that I thought it was like that just come out,
Yeah.
and we realized it was 9 years old, which is wild. So we want to give credit to the Rewild. I think it was called
Mm-hmm.
Rewild. Credit to that podcast, and also the guest author. A lot of people know of this author, John Gray. He wrote the famous book, "Women Are from Venus, Men Are from Mars," or it might be backwards, but like a relationship guru in a sense.
Yeah.
And
Oh, I think almost 40 years ago,
that's right.
wrote the book, and there's been,
Yeah.
something I'd heard about many times before, hadn't read yet, when I listened to the podcast, and I've started reading it since. And I think I kind of discounted it, and he
Mm-hmm.
mentions that in the podcast too, that a lot of people do because it's been around for so long. They
Mm-hmm.
just assume that it's old knowledge, old information, and I was really fascinated, learning through the podcast that this is John Gray. Was somebody who actively, like, he was an author, obviously, on relationships, but actively was working with clients and with couples, um, and has gone on to do that for the last 40 years since writing the book, and has continued
Yeah.
to publish things, continued to put information material out, and has what I found a very fresh perspective, even though, as Dustin
Mm-hmm.
said, we discovered
Mm-hmm.
that the recording we were listening to was 9 years old as well.
Mm-hmm.
But just a lot of things that came up that inspired different thought in me than I'd had
Yeah.
before, and um, was excited. Dustin and I actually have not had that much time to talk about the podcast after each listening to it, and
Mm-hmm.
so I'm excited to just discuss that and bring up the highlights, and we'll link the podcast in our notes of this podcast so that y'all can check that out too. And um, I think, like a lot of things that are inspiring in my life, there were questions answered, but more than anything, like, it gave me a lot more questions. And
Mm-hmm.
just listening to that podcast, I think I added like 5 books to my reading list that now I want to follow up on and learn more.
Yeah, one of the ones we actually he referenced, we haven't found it yet. I think it was called The Conscious Man.
Yeah.
I liked in the podcast, so some of the things that got me excited were some of the other books he mentioned that are in alignment with my favorite books. And anyone who's listened to our podcast
Yeah.
knows some of our favorite books are actually, I think, linked in the podcast on Spotify. Living Untethered by Michael Brown, Presence Process by
That's by Michael
that's Michael
Brown.
Brown. Michael Singer is, yeah, Living Untethered. Too many Michaels. And then Jason Blood on the masculine relationship, and then there was a while where I actually was like, I'm never gonna date anybody. I'm not gonna date any woman who hasn't read Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and that was when I first read it years ago.
No
That was
kidding.
probably like 8 years ago.
See, I didn't even know this.
It just affected me so
I
much.
didn't know that you'd read it years
Oh
ago
yeah,
either.
and actually, one of my friends,
I'm just curious.
she used to work with him
Okay.
here in Newport. They worked in the same office, so
Okay.
she actually knows him.
Right.
So I've nerded out on this guy's content a lot, and he mentioned then well then there's also the way of the superior man.
I'm forgetting
forget
the
the author. That's but like for men, there's
Mhm.
also is it here? King, warrior, lover, magician.
No
So we're
worries.
throwing out.
Right.
Yeah, these are like as a man. I know there's some female equivalents. I don't have those all memorized, but there's they're just heavy hitters.
Mhm.
Like how can from a soul can I live from my heart? How can I be more embodied, be more masculine in friendship and relationship and work and in all the areas and what feels the most wholesome. And so he then John Gray mentioned 9 years ago, this book I think is called The Conscious Man.
That he'd just
Yeah.
written then 9 years ago.
Yeah, and we haven't found it yet, but that's coming up. That we both want to find that. So I guess with, a lot of the explanation of why we're so excited about it, one of the things I loved the most about that podcast was he gets a lot, and we're going to be careful that we're not going to misquote anything here. So, but he talks a lot about the hormones, and he addresses part of how our culture has had some unintended consequences of equality and trying to stay away from sameness, but equal, but also hormonally what happens in a female body and a male body, not just with the masculine and feminine energies, but the hormones. And one thing I do remember is, and this made me think of cold plunges as well.
Okay.
Is somebody that we both know really well. She was doing cold plunges and she likes them to an extent, but she doesn't get that zen, peaceful feeling that we get. And cold plunges spike your testosterone. And as a man, with a male, anatomy, I guess, and hormonally what my body's attuned to, that feels very good.
Yeah.
And it helps get me in like the flow state. But she, having that cold plunge spike her testosterone and her dopamine, but she felt kind of agitated. She didn't feel that peaceful resting state that you and I both feel, and a lot of men we know. And one step further was in the workplace, how that affects men and women differently as an unintended consequence of the equality of women being in the workplace so much more in recent decades. Maybe you can touch on anything like that.
Yeah, I also found that section really interesting, and again, kind of preface to this, something I really appreciated about the book is not a labeling of right or wrong, or for the intense and dramatic shifts we've had culturally within masculine femininity. It's more plausible in modernity than it's ever been before for there to be a fluidity of the masculine energy into the feminine and the feminine energy into the masculine. Like it really at no time in history was that as plausible or as safe for that to happen before. But not labeling right or wrong or good or bad. It's just happening, and how do we respond to it? Biologically, there are still things that show up differently hormonally, and this is a part, as you brought up, that I was less familiar with and was really interesting to me. And there may be newer data on that too, and I'm sure John Gray has newer data on it too, as this was 9 years ago. But even what he was saying then were some things that I hadn't heard, and one of the things that Dustin is referencing to is the statistical, very chartable increase in testosterone in women operating in an intense workplace.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, the male and female bodies process these different hormones quite differently,
Hmm.
where testosterone can show up. And this is again an overview because
Yeah.
these are not our studies.
Yeah.
Testosterone can have a very clarifying, um, calming instance and experience for a man when that not only increases, but as the body's using it. Um,
Yeah.
and so like it can be a very clarifying, focusing, driving hormone, um, when it's increasing, when the production, and then after it's used, there's a very, zen feeling, a very calming or relaxing. And,
Hmm.
he was explaining that's a lot of reason, like, that men often when they come home from work, like they need to do nothing for a while.
Hmm.
Like whether that's watch TV or,
Hmm.
sit and stare at a wall, take a walk, putter around in the garage, really like whatever
Yeah.
that is, but just having that kind of refractory period to rebuild that. But it's a very zen space, and
Mm.
that's fundamentally not how it shows up in the female body, as far as like he was explaining it, and it can often
Hormonally.
hormonally,
Yeah.
stress stays high, remains high. It doesn't the testosterone in that instance doesn't give peace or a zen feeling afterwards, or and that was just really interesting. And so there's just different, because of that, different coping mechanisms, different a way of living that humans are still learning how to do, that we haven't figured out yet.
Mm.
That we're still kind of in flux. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, it really was. It was just, I've read so many books and had so many conversations about, masculine, feminine, and our cultures changing and shifting. And even right now, as we're recording this, there's a lot of energy being thrown around
Mm.
in this arena too, with politics. There's all kinds of stuff going on. I know I'm a big fan of equality,
Hmm.
huge fan. I have so many women that I'm close to that I respect and love. I'm not a fan of sameness.
Yeah.
And I think this is part of biologically more information on how do we engage with that. If we
Hmm.
have unintended consequences, like for example, a woman having equal rights to work, to follow her dreams and her passions, but then at the same time, hormonally, her testosterone is higher. It's not giving a traditional man in that role, like she has to engage differently with that.
Hmm.
Like I remember somebody that we met last year, um, beautiful woman, in that 3 week intensive we
Yeah.
did. And I remember her telling me she's a hard worker, she's very successful, and
Yeah.
she really likes that. And she's like, when I go home to my husband, I just have to, she's doing more of a, like a male
Right.
thing where
Right.
she's like so overloaded with that stress, with that testosterone. She's so not in harmony with herself when she gets home. She's like, sometimes I can't talk to him for like an hour.
Yeah.
I just have to shut down. I have to run. I have to get away because when I get home, I'm not in a good, loving, feminine space.
Mm.
And I thought that was interesting. So I think he also brings up oxytocin, and these are things I don't want to misquote, but I definitely want to address this piece as best we can because it's
Hmm.
so important.
Hmm.
Hormones, even in my personal life, have just in in a very huge way positively impacted my life. And so I'm researching and learning more about
Hmm.
hormones and how that affects everything in ways like I knew that, like I'm educated to a reasonable level, but I didn't know how much
Yeah.
and the nuances and the details. And so when it comes to this, we're in a culture now where very much embodying equality a lot more. We've gotten confused in sameness. I think we're now shifting out of that more. There's like a
Hmm.
cultural energy I feel, which I'm happy about. But then how do we embody that? How do we navigate that?
Hmm.
Addressing very real hormonal things happening where we're not the same
Hmm.
and honoring the freedoms, the rights, dreams, intentions, all that stuff, and then honoring your system and knowing how to adjust to that.
Right.
And and so I just think that's so fascinating. And I'm trying to remember too, um, there was another piece here with this. So in my journey, my spiritual journey, and especially reading some of these books and in recent relationships, doing my best to embody those.
Mm-hmm.
And so it actually comes to, this podcast. So I think this is really fun to share this is I am more sensitive. I'm intuitive. I am very sensitive as a male body, stereotypically from the average guy. Um, and and so I've gravitated more towards a podcast, to sharing, to opening, to expressing, to talking about emotions, to
Mm-hmm.
doing these things. That's also a big part of what I do professionally.
Mm-hmm.
I love this stuff. And something that John Gray said in the episode was so fascinating, where I've gotten into a lot of talking, a lot more talking at times that I would like to, in relationships, where I'm at my limit. And then it's like, how do you constructively
Mm-hmm.
communicate that? Because I know the value in listening. I know the value in emotions. It's very important. And John Gray said some things that made me kind of perk up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, from a masculine perspective, he'll do this thing with his wife where he listens. And most men, this is a not a traditionally positive forte for women, or sorry, for men. Listening with intention, seeking to understand, not reacting,
Right.
responding, listening, understanding, and not giving a solution, right? Not trying to fix it. And that's like some of his older work. But then flipping back to honoring the male side of this is something that I used to get caught up in, is I would regurgitate, I would say back, and this can go on and on and on and on. And he's at a place with his, wife 9 years ago, at least, where he would say, he would listen, and he just says, I hear you. And when he would say that, he did the listening, he did the connecting, he would let her unpack what she needed to without trying to fix it. But then he would honor himself when he felt he either understood it or he was at his limit, to where he knows then now, as in my male energy, I'm redlining. And if I continue sitting here, I'm not going to behave in the most constructive way I can. So I just need to say, I hear you. And then his wife, in meeting him and respecting his needs, is like, okay, I got to unpack. He did his best. He's not reacting. I feel safe. He's not going to leave me. And now I get to respect him because I know he's not going to be constructive at this point. And now we're both winning. And that part of the dance was very interesting to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was really fascinating too, and I'm interested to hear y'all's feedback after listening to the podcast as well, because there was so much information even behind that, and just like the path to figuring out the dance, that he was doing with his wife, and what she needed, as far as conversationally, and how that worked, to needing to unpack that and tell him things again without looking for a solution, not seeking his advice on it, sharing it, and then him learning the useful pattern and habit of receiving that, hearing that, and not offering, advice, not offering, which is something many males really, really want to do. We want to fix and natively assume the reason someone would be telling us any issues is they're looking for a solution. And just, kind of explaining the different way that he's really understood that, coming from the feminine and the masculine perspective. And so I think like it is very involved, and learning that with your partner is very involved. But that was one thing I really loved about his research and his work, is the validity and the usefulness of learning that with your partner, prolonging of how much doing that work and learning how each other do relate, what is most useful in conversation, what is most useful in how they show up with each other, how greatly that enhances every other aspect of their relationship, how much life and excitement and virility that brings to their relationship and excites them to continue, as opposed to I feel what happens in a lot of relationships is we don't really ever learn how to communicate with our partner.
Mm.
I've seen this an immense amount of times around me and my parents' generation and my generation, where that work isn't done. They're not making the mistakes to figure out how do we do this better. There just becomes like this frustration level build up and an acceptance of not communicating, an acceptance of not knowing or trusting or really knowing where your partner is coming from. And I think our relationships, I mean, very visibly are suffering from that unwillingness that we have to be vulnerable and authentic early on and continuously with our partners. To stumble in the pursuit of finding a way that works better, in pursuit of finding a way that is holistic and creates a legitimate and authentic desire in the other person to continue in that relationship, continue showing up at 100%, not just the parts that feel safe with the person. And so I thought that was really encouraging. Not easy, like a lot of like what he was saying was like, it didn't sound like, oh man, this is going to be fun to go practice at home. Like it sounded really hard and really challenging, but really worth it.
I love that, and I was just realizing as you were saying that I think if I could simplify or summarize one big point here on my end is really, from my perspective, a lot of the things of communication and hearing and listening and honoring, like none of that's new to me. The part that was new is honoring the male needs in the process and bringing that to the table in a way that almost seemed oversimplistic, in a way I wasn't doing traditionally, as I started waking up to like, okay, this is a better way to communicate. I think that was a new thing he brought in. And so I think, simply put, that was part of the like, whoa. And you actually said, what was it? We were talking the other day. There was a part about how he was talking about how men, I'm blanking on it right now, but I was so excited about it. How men, when we communicate like our needs, there was a key difference you brought up in the summary. And it really, do you remember that?
It's not.
There were so many pieces. Because he got into sexuality, he got into hormones, he got into, I think that was it. It was part of like how our podcast might shift. Of the masculine energy is not about oversharing. And there was an interesting thing where we were talking about, I think, where it's, just us like this. If we have a male guest, if we have a feminine guest, how us and our embodied masculinity, knowing we also have feminine energy, there's a dance there within each person, is how much in my masculine energy am I gently holding space to pierce the feminine energy and let that feminine energy open up to me, because that's nourishing to the feminine energy. It's not an uninvited piercing. It's not like that. It's just, I'm here to hold space and listen. The feminine energy will tend to want to unpack more without a solution. And so just by that beautiful harmony and, both those energies being open, the male energy is not just physically or sexually piercing, it is energetically piercing, and hence why the female energy is more open. And it was something big about that we were talking about, where in this podcast, as two men sharing a lot, that can be a more feminine energy.
For sure.
And how we may or may not shift. There's little nuances that might be shifting and making this, podcast more embodied for our female guests, more in attune for, our male guests, and just
more alignment
shift for us.
More alignment for us.
Yeah.
I think. So this is one of the things I brought up like initially, after listening to it, and I think both of us really wanted to know a lot more about certain aspects of this, because that was a podcast too. So it's an overview of this man's life's work, and so like there's so much there and so much going on. But he was talking about a lot of our modern way of showing up in relationship. You know, there is a lot more fluidity. There is a lot more opportunity for a male to enter and flow into the masculine or the feminine energy, and that can be very sharing the emotions, very, more open, more authentic in that conversation. And he was just saying, historically and biologically, that's often not actually helpful
Mm,
to the relationship. As
that's
much
what
as
it
a
was. Yeah.
female may desire the man to show up in that, it it takes the polarity out of the relationship. It
Mm-hmm.
enters, like, this is what we were talking about before,
Mm-hmm.
more of a sameness. Like, you become a good friend in that, but it takes away a lot of the actual excitement, a lot of the passion, the polarity. And so it can feel good emotionally or in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but often when that happens, like, sexual desire in between the couple diminishes
Mm-hmm.
or disappears
That's funny.
completely. And there's a lot of other attributes that initially the people were attracted to each other.
Mm.
um, they're no longer there because you've entered this space of sameness, and there's confusion because it feels like you're doing the right thing. It feels like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm being open. I'm stepping into this
Yeah.
new consciousness, a new way
Yeah.
of being open and vulnerable. And I think that was the distinction he was making, is that is
Yes.
very useful for males and the masculine energy to do
Males with males.
with each other,
Yes.
and not inherently with the female or
With the
with the
feminine
partner, with
energy.
the
Yep.
feminine energy.
Yeah.
And that was really, really interesting to me,
Yeah.
because obviously we live in a world that is still changing. I mean, like, he was saying that too. He's like, um, have more grace for ourselves and where we are and figuring this out. Like,
Mm.
this is so, so new
Mm-hmm.
in the history of humans, like, that this was even an option. Even 200 years ago, like, for a partner to expect another their partner to actually understand them or know where they're energetically or
Mm-hmm.
emotionally coming from
Mm-hmm.
was ridiculous.
Mm.
Like, it was much more,
In the
relationships were
tribal
based,
cultures and stuff.
absolutely,
Yeah.
much more based out of survival, out of function. You had a role.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and an amazing thing about where we are in society today, and with our excess and surplus,
Mm.
um, we have the ability to be so much more fluid. We can do so many different things, male or female, and do things that were, typically performed by another gender. And that's amazing. And it's opened up all kinds of fluidity in the workplace, in relationship, within friendships,
Equality. Yeah.
and equality there, which is brilliant. But as you said before, there's been some unintended consequences
Mm.
for that. And I think our relationships
Mm.
are absolutely experiencing, like, the fallout from some of that. I mean,
Yeah.
we're,
Oh yeah.
over 50% divorce rate. And it's not because we don't want to be in a relationship. These are not people divorcing so they never get married again. Like,
Yeah.
in the 90 percentile, those people then go get married again.
They're still seeking
They're
that.
still
Yeah.
they desire
Yeah.
that,
The
but
connection.
we don't know how to do it anymore. Or there are new, maybe not even not how to do it anymore. Like, we're struggling, evolving to this new
Yes.
status and
How do
this
we do
new,
it in this modern world?
this new place that we are. And I think that, that's a brilliant energy to show up to this, and is that we are discovering this is new, this is different than it's ever been. It's
Mm.
exciting, but we haven't figured it out. And
Mm.
and so there's going to be stumbling, there's
Mm-hmm.
going to be misunderstandings along that way, and uncomfortability.
Oh yeah.
Um,
I'm so glad that you remember, because that was that nuance, which
mhm,
was mind blowing in a sense, I guess, for a man like me who is more tapped into this modern approach, who isn't a stereotypical, you know, I need to drink a beer and watch football, and I don't like my emotions, and that's just not my style. And so that was a massive, like, there's one thing for me that I take away from that is sharing and connecting and listening and seeking to understand and letting the female energy unpack without solving it, massively winning.
mhm,
Unintended consequences then, right, when the female's like, well, I want you to share, I want you to open up. And I got caught up in this a lot where, okay, no, I shouldn't be doing that. as much. I can just like I can't share. It's not, but I don't need to unpack all this stuff because then the unintended consequences, the polarity,
Mm-hmm.
dies, the sexuality dies, she becomes more the mother. It's like, okay, got what I wanted, but now I realize I don't want it
Mm-hmm.
from the feminine energy. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
ooh, this is confusing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that dance, that's that polarity. There should be in the polarity some um I think healthy friction or resistance
Mm-hmm.
there. Not negative, not fighting, nothing like that, but it's the polarity of the energies. There
Mm-hmm.
is that polarity, that dance. That's what maintains the feminine being nourished, the masculine being nourished, and the sexual polarity that I think keeps the relationship interesting and healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then as the men, we can unpack that,
Mm-hmm.
but with men.
Yeah.
And that's the big piece that I think is also a part of this modern culture.
Mm-hmm.
Because going back to the tribe, right? The men were hunting, they were exposed to danger, they were doing a lot of it in silence. And we were talking about this with a female friend of the women at that time, which I think biologically there's a wiring that's now being challenged with
Yeah.
that from like the reptilian part of the brain almost is she was just happy if he came home alive.
Right.
She didn't like it was just like great, let's now connect in our polarity.
Mm-hmm.
And even hormonally, this was an interesting thing. I think I remember this piece is that when there's a fight,
Mm-hmm.
the male, the masculine, the testosterone is lifted and it stays because he had to be prepared for the threat. He had to protect. He had to defend. When there's a fight, like in a modern day couple, the female, her feminine, like response to that testosterone, it spikes in the fight and then it goes down. Because in the tribe, she had to go back to nurturing the
Mm-hmm.
kids and holding a safe space. And that is still hormonally happening in our systems.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why after a fight, the women, or even after sex, the female typically wants to snuggle and cuddle and share and connect. And the men, to your point earlier, I need to be alone.
Yeah.
My testosterone's still jacked. We're not going to have a successful situation here. I think if the female and the male understand this and not honor, well, yeah, I've heard that, but I don't like it. And it's like, okay, maybe I should do that, but it's hard. There's a legit hormonal thing
Yeah.
happening for both of us, which is unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really powerful thing to honor.
Mm-hmm. I think it is. It's really, and there's, again, this was 9 years ago, but I think then and since then, there's been an amazing amount of research and science gone into kind of what we are experiencing now. Like, I think internally, relationally, we've evolved way past where our biology
Mm.
has evolved at this point.
Huh.
And it's catching up with us. And it's like,
Yeah.
I want to show up in a space. I want it to be more fluid, but there's something inside that is making this really difficult. And it keeps
Yeah.
being a struggle. We're falling out.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think it's so helpful to pay attention to that, not to go back to old roles or to not allow equality, but to give ourselves grace
Adjusting.
and adjusting and moving forward and
Yeah.
and trying to actually live out this new paradigm, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of our biology's got to catch up with that, and there's repercussions for acting like that's not happening.
Yes.
And
Well
I think
said.
the repercussions for that are
Well said.
relationships falling apart.
Mhm.
I think it's sameness. I think you end up with an immense amount of couples, and I'm sure a lot of us have experienced that, where like it was very exciting at first,
Mhm.
and then you become just kind of great friends. Like you
Yeah.
move into this because it feels socially right, like this
Yes.
sameness,
Politically correct.
politically correct, that you end up, trying to do and talk and share the same
Mhm.
everything, and the excitement dies.
Yeah.
It disappears, and it is absolutely reversible,
Mm.
but it's by practicing things that are more in line with where our biology still is. Even though if that feels more patterned or feels more um, stereotypically like gender typing, and that's like it's not the point, not the energy it's being done with. It's
Yeah.
respecting the other,
Yes.
but but
Yes.
also respecting the things we can't change, which is our biology and
Our-
how hormones are released
yeah,
and dissipated
yeah,
in our
yeah.
bodies. And I think like that's a wild thing. And there's been a huge increase in estrogen um, in almost every person in like kind of first world civilizations because of the way we treat water, produce foods,
Mm,
and add to things. And like again, this
yeah.
isn't bad, but estrogen shows up very differently in a male body and operates very differently in a male body than it does in a female body. He was talking about kind of depending on the water and how it was being treated. There were certain locations and places where females were entering into puberty years sooner than they had
Mm,
previously,
yeah.
and males, because of the increase in estrogen, were years later. And again, like it's hard to put on this like necessarily a right or a wrong, but there are repercussions for that happening. There are repercussions
Yeah.
internally, biologically, and because of that, relationally.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point because it's something I've talked a lot about professionally as well, more and more and more this year, is honoring the results of blood work.
Mm-hmm.
Because I work in a mental emotional realm for the most part, and I have a massive appreciation for allopathic doctors for like more emergencies and stuff like that, and required medications if that is needed. And also a growing respect and love personally and professionally for naturopathy, and not just a typical CBC blood work, but full blood panels
Yeah.
going through all your hormones, not just your white blood cells and your red blood cells. And I think tying relationship to what you're saying, environment, food, toxins, you know, things we put in our body. I'll just
Mm-hmm.
be more general there. Anything that we put in our body and things we're exposed to, that has an impact on our hormones, right? We know this. Like, I know I should eat well. I know I should work out. Like all these things, cold plunges,
Yeah.
working out, fasting, nutrition, environment, pollutants, organic, all these things, that all has an impact. So to me, it's like how through behavior and social interaction is that adjusting and messing with my hormones, and how am I naturally like how is my system responding to that? How is then that sustained? What hormones are doing what? Then how long is that happening? How is my peak off of that compared to the feminine? Equal, not the same. And so then invite, what am I putting in my body? What am I around? And then the blood work and all that, and my behavior to bring it all together
Mm-hmm.
in really optimizing and honoring my male system and all the things I can do to be healthy,
Mm-hmm.
honor that pattern and not be surprised by it. Like I'm beating my head against the wall, like my heart's open, I'm trying, I'm communicating, I'm being loving, I'm supporting my woman, and I'm doing this and I'm working hard and all this, but I still feel like something's just off.
Mm-hmm.
And what is going on? And this podcast was a huge eye opener and another piece of that puzzle, that a lot of light bulbs went off, and there's so much we haven't even chatted about on that episode. He gets a lot of sexuality,
A ton. Yeah.
prostate, masturbation, sex, frequency, the hormones there, um, and I mean, just I'll say one thing there is what was fascinating is for the male, if more than a week, he was saying he likes to have an orgasm every week, whether it's with his partner or something's happening and him and his wife can't have sex, then he does manual stimulation, not just for pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
It's to keep his prostate, keep that fluidity there,
Mm-hmm.
so he's way less likely to have prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Even things like that he got into, which were so fascinating, and I think extremely useful. And I don't think a lot of people know this.
Yeah. I think I would agree with that. I mean, this is something that a field that both of us are intrigued by and have been for years. And there was a lot of new information, even though it was 9 years old. There was a lot of new
Yeah,
information
yeah,
in it for me. And so, my assumption is that it is something most people are not familiar with. Um, and I think so many of us are experiencing the results of these things, experiencing difficulties and stuff, and haven't heard that there is an alternate way. That haven't
Yeah.
heard that there are different habits that we can occupy. There are
Hmm.
different ways to show up in the masculinity, in the femininity, that biologically really supports
Hmm.
our
Yeah.
relationship uh, to a greater extent, potentially than we've even imagined.
Mm. Mm.
And because I think a lot of us don't have actually models
Oh,
of relationships
yeah.
around that are ideal. You know, like we very few of us have uh, instances of other people we look like and like, oh, I'm going to copy what they're doing because that really seems to be working uh, holistically.
Mm.
I mean, I think we all know people that are doing great in different areas, and I think a lot of my history that's been true too. Like, I've been really healthy in a few areas, and then
Mm.
like holistically not great. And I'm
Always
really
too, bro.
excited that that's really been changing.
Yeah.
Um, as I've been focusing on holistic health and
Mm.
for the last decade or so, and like
Hmm.
I've seen a huge shift in that. But it's been uh, with great intention and a whole lot of learning, a whole lot of mistakes, and
Hmm.
so much of our desire here is really just to to open people up to the reality that there are different ways than we currently know.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
there is more going on here in your relationship and why it might not be working than just you and your partner. Like biologically, there could be things at play here too.
Yeah.
Obviously, society plays a huge, our environment plays a huge role, and we know that. But knowing that and choosing habits and stuff to adapt to that or show up in more supportive ways are different things. And I think that's what excited us. I
Yeah.
mean, I'll speak for myself. What excited me about the podcast was just that it it pointed out some things. It filled in some gaps that I had around relationship and what was going on there. But more than that, it offered a way uh, to not counteract that, but a way to interact with that that can still be that can be nourishing, that can be holistic, can be fulfilling, can be exciting, can restore passion and energy to a relationship.
Yeah, and just a few things I want to add to that is if I zoom out and try to get a bird's eye view on this
Hmm.
is there's a lot of communication tactics, so many books out there. There's so many like strategies and things you can do differently and this, and it's like I don't think a lot of that is new in the information age these days. Very useful,
Hmm.
hard to embody. There's a reason that is prevalent, but not new. The thing that was new for me was, this hormonal piece, this
That's true.
connecting the biology, like you're
Yeah.
saying. And there's some very fascinating things there of helping the female understand the male and his needs and how he hormonally is different than her in ways that may not be obvious,
Hmm.
and vice versa.
Yeah.
And honoring not just, okay, I know a woman has typically, more emotional and loves to talk more. Like there's stereotypes there, but how hormonally,
Hmm.
sexually, with oxytocin, different things happening there. What are things I can do and cannot do, not just to be loving and supportive and kind, but to actually help her optimize her hormones, and the female then doing that for the male and doing that dance is so beautiful.
Hmm.
And not just woo woo, not just emotionally, like okay, it's all this like, some people might have that like it's all this emotional stuff. This is like science.
Yeah.
This is legit. And to me, that was, if I zoom out, I think that was the biggest thing that got me excited about this. Um, and I'm definitely gonna listen to that episode again,
For sure.
and we'll put that in the link. And I hope we did a somewhat satisfactory job of addressing this, because I kind of went off the cuff. This is our first time doing this in person, so hopefully this was enjoyable, and it'd be fun to do this again.
Yeah.
Getting better at it.
I concur. I
Yeah.
appreciate you bringing back I think what did excite both of
Mm,
us the most was that biology piece.
hmm.
And that
Yeah.
was the newest aspect to it. And I think there's a lot more there, that we get into. And, I think some of the disjointed, um, reality of today's podcast too is there was so much in that podcast and so many things we did want to bring up and talk
Yeah,
about.
that we didn't.
But, yeah, so, more than anything, I hope that piques some curiosity,
Hmm.
and points you towards some ways to actually find out more information on this biology piece.
Hmm.
And, I appreciate you bringing up the blood work,
Yeah.
and resources for finding that, because I think that's huge, and, that can be a piece that we're just overlooking, that that really, that should be addressed in modernity. So I'm
Hmm.
grateful for that, and looking forward to hearing your feedback.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. There might be a part two to this. Who knows? We'll see.
Yeah, that'd
But
be great.
hope y'all having a great week, great day. Thank you for tuning in. And until next time.